Today's a special video, a very special video because I get to share with you my music production setup. The focus is gonna be mostly on hardware, and we're gonna start off with this cabinet right here. This is where most of the magic happens. It's a little bit dusty. This thing right here, this is a Furman power conditioner. All of these devices are connected to this in the back. And so if I want to activate or I want to turn everything on, then all I have to do is just flip this switch and then it turns on. There are two main purposes for a power conditioner. One is that it acts as a surge protector. This stands in between all this gear and the power source. So in this case, it's going to be some outlet on one of the walls in my apartment. So if there's a surge of electricity that could potentially fry my equipment, then this is actually what's going to take the hit. It's a relatively inexpensive piece of gear. It's between $100, $200, but it's well worth its value because I'd rather have this get fried than anything that's over here. Right now, I live in a relatively modern building. There are multiple surge protection mechanisms built into the facilities here. But in the past, I've lived in older buildings where the electricity is not as reliable, so this is critical to have. So that's the first purpose, right? We talked about surge protection. The second purpose is it acts as a filter for EMI and RFI signals. EMI stands for electromagnetic interference signals, and RFI stands for radio frequency interference signals. So what it does is that it filters all that crap that might be picked up from either cables around or from maybe a next door apartment. It cleans that out and improves the clarity of the audio signals that run through this whole system here. When I first started recording audio, especially with my analog synthesizer, which is right here, you can't see it in the frame, I used a Scarlett 2i2 interface. And what drove me nuts is that it was always picking up all kinds of random signals, and I couldn't figure out how to eliminate it. I was using things like DI boxes, or I was messing around with the placement of the cables on the floor, making sure that cables don't overlap, because sometimes when cables overlap, they pick up crap from each other. A power conditioner is very critical for eliminating all that noise and all that hum. In addition to also getting a really good audio interface, which leads me to my next piece of gear. So this right here is the centerpiece for my whole music production setup. It's my Universal Audio Apollo X8 audio interface. I obviously did not start off with this interface. The first interface was a Scarlett 2i2. Then I graduated to an Apollo Twin. But as I continued to do research and I planned out the system that I really wanted to set up for myself for producing music, including other outboard gear such as stereo compressors and master bus processors, I needed more inputs and outputs. And the Apollo Twin is very limited, which is what led me to eventually getting this one. In addition to all of the inputs and outputs that it has in the back, it also has these two high frequency inputs, which I can connect mono instruments. So having it right here in front of me makes it very convenient. The next piece of gear, this thing right here, is a DBX preamp and compressor. This was the first piece of gear that I bought after an audio interface. This is a budget channel strip. This is not very expensive. It's around $200. Back when I just started recording my vocals, I was trying to test different microphones and different setups. This specific channel strip worked really well with this microphone. And both of them are pretty cheap. Like this one is like $85 or something. They don't even manufacture these anymore. This is an AKG D690. I tested a bunch of very expensive microphones, including the Neumann microphones. I got an Avantone microphone, which is something that Taylor Swift at some point in time swore by. But for some reason, this microphone and this compressor just worked really well for my vocals, and I ended up keeping it. Because if something works and it sounds good, then why change it? Why mess with it? The next piece of gear right here is my solid-state Logic Xlogic G-Series stereo bus compressor. That was a mouthful. This is my prized piece possession, and it sits on my master chain. Now, I want to talk about pro audio gear like this for just a second. Unless you're working at a record studio or you studied audio engineering at a university, the likelihood of you ever interacting with a piece of gear like this is pretty low, which makes it difficult for you to ever even think about pulling a trigger on such a very expensive piece of gear. Like if you're just browsing on Sweetwater and you're seeing all these compressors, a lot of them look interesting, cool, but you don't really know what they sound like and you don't really know exactly how they're going to operate. So how did I know what exactly I want to buy? I heard about this piece of gear from Swedish House Mafia. There was a Future Music interview on YouTube where they interviewed Sebastian Ingrosso, Axwell, and Steve Angelo, and they're sitting there in the record studio and talking about the mixing board and whatnot. Solid State Logic manufactures a lot of the mixing boards that exist at recording studios. And inside that mixing board, in the center of it, sits a stereo bus compressor, which is this exact thing. Well, not exactly this, it's built into the mixing board, but then they eventually created a standalone rack unit, which is what you see right over here. In the interview with Swedish House Mafia, you can see Steve Angelo is kind of talking about this being their secret weapon. And Sebastian Ingrosso is telling Steve to like, shut up in Swedish. Here's a snippet so you guys see what I'm talking about.
Just to finish off, tell us about what was on the master channel for this one in the Logic session.
In the Logic session...
We can't tell you.
Oh, is it still a secret?
We can't tell you what
But
we
you
do.
know what?
I can tell, I can say one
Säg
thing. We used an EQ.
Säg det lite bara.
We used an EQ.
Why should we tell them?
We used an EQ and then the SSL
and
compressor.
The Engrossor.
Yeah.
And we have a special machine called the Engrossor.
It's kind of like the Distressor there.
But it says Engrossor.
Yeah.
So you heard Steve say SSL, right? Axwell mentioned Distressor, by the way, and I'm gonna talk about that in just a moment. But the second Steve mentioned SSL, that put me down a rabbit hole. I discovered SSL stands for Solid State Logic. They manufacture all these mixing boards. They also create industry standard compressors. And I came across a variety of their pro audio gear and eventually narrowed it down to this one. So when I first saw the price, I got a mini heart attack because it's expensive, you know, and I've never bought gear like this before. But once I calmed down, I told myself I'm gonna do whatever it takes to get this. In the next video, I wanna show you what it sounds like. So I'm gonna do a comparison video between this, an analog compressor, and the Ableton stock compressor. Right now, there's gonna be a pop-up somewhere here on the screen. You can click on that and watch the video, but after you finish watching this video. Last but not least is the Rupert Neve Master Bus processor. This is the Portico II. I knew that whatever I do, I have to have a Neve piece in my setup. Now let me tell you, this is a beast. There's channel A and channel B, and you can apply different compression parameters to each channel. Now originally when I looked at this Master Bus processor, I thought to myself, why would I want to apply compression differently on channel A and channel B? And I always had this link button on, which essentially you control the compression for both channels here on the left. You actually apply compression differently for the mid and the side channels. So it's not the left and the right. You can route your mid information to channel A and the side information to channel B and process it differently. What you have over here on the side with these four knobs is that you can focus on a specific frequency range and you can either increase the depth or width, or you can decrease the depth or width. There will definitely be a video about that, so I'll show you how to set that up. There are two other pieces of gear that I had in the past that I sold off. One of them was the TG2 Chandler Limited Preamp. This is a piece of gear that I saw in Benny Blanco's studio and also in Charlie Puth's studio.
These are the compressors. This is like a compression cocktail of stuff I put on my vocals.
Me personally, it didn't pass the 15% rule. It didn't make enough of a difference in my setup to keep it. Also because Universal Audio's 1073 preamp is a phenomenal emulation. It does exactly what I need and it sounds just as good. The second piece of gear that I had was an 1176 LN mono compressor. It's a legendary compressor. It's been around for years and in studios all over the world. When you buy a Universal Audio interface, it comes with a bunch of plugins. One of them is the 1176 LN compressor. So after doing an A/B test between the software plugin that they have and the hardware version, I couldn't hear any noticeable difference. And whatever difference there was, it was washed away, especially after you use like processing gear like this stereo compressor and this Master Bus processor. It doesn't make any difference. There was one more piece of gear that I almost bought, and that's the Distressor compressor. It's the same Distressor that Axwell mentioned in the video that I showed before.
It's kind of like the Distressor there.
I've seen it in Kevin Parker's setup, Adam Wiles, and also Anton Zaslavsky. Distressor compressors are mono compressors. Usually you buy them in pairs. That's why you'll see them in like bundled deals like on Sweetwater. They have a very unique tone to them and they sound phenomenal on the drums. And I tried out the plugin version. Honestly, the plugin version sounded amazing. So for now, I'm good enough with the software plugin. I don't think I'm ever gonna buy the hardware. So this setup is phenomenal and everything, but if I don't have the right glue, then I'm not doing it justice. I have to have high quality cables to connect all these devices together. There are many brands out there in the market, but there's one that I really trust and I've had great results with, and that's Mogami. So the majority of the cables that I have are Mogami, but they're not Mogami branded. So meaning I didn't buy them off the shelf like at a Guitar Center or online, because typically that's actually more expensive. What I did is that I got my cables custom made at a shop called Pro Audio Lay. They're based in Glendale, Los Angeles. They do custom cabling, acoustics, they sell pro audio gear. And so what I did is I created a spreadsheet for myself where I have all my devices and I looked at the inputs and outputs and what connects to what and submitted a custom order for all the cables that I needed. And they make their cables using Mogami components. So it might not be Mogami branded, but the internals are Mogami. me. I've been using these cables for several years now and they've been great. They've been phenomenal. I haven't had any issues with them. And there's also like a lifetime warranty. So if something does happen, I can always go back to the shop. All right, that's it about my cables. Let's talk about monitoring for a second. I got two main pairs of mixing headphones. I got these DT770 Pros. These are built like a tank. You can toss them around and they'll never break. I've had these for years. They're good, but I only use them to really monitor when I'm recording vocals or if I'm recording my guitar synthesizer, but I don't really use them to mix. I also got these Sony headphones, which are the MDR7506. I just have a second pair in case I have another vocalist coming in. But otherwise, I mostly rely on the Yamaha HS8s, which I have over here. These are phenomenal monitors, by the way, phenomenal. Or I use my Apple earbuds. The majority of my mixing and mastering decisions are done with these headphones right here. And I'll explain to you why. The majority of the people listening to your music are gonna be listening either on the speakers of a smartphone or with headphones that are like that or some competitor to that. It could be nice to listen to your music on very expensive monitors in a high-end studio, but the reality is almost anything will sound good in that environment. You really have to optimize for those smartphone speakers, for the headphones, and for car stereos. Obviously, it's not 100% reliance on just these. I will talk more about that in an upcoming video. That's pretty much it in terms of my pro audio gear. Let's talk about my musical instruments for a second, and then let's wrap this video up. In 2017, when I was producing music, a lot of it sounded dull. Thin, lifeless. I didn't have a lot of mixing knowledge and I wasn't very technical. So what I would do is I'd reach out to artists whose music I admired and I'd ask them, what kind of gear do you use? What kind of setup do you have? How do you process your audio? A lot of the artists that I reached out to didn't respond, but there was one guy who was generous enough to share a lot of information with me, and his name is Goffe. You might know him as Home. He produced a song called Resonance, which recently blew up all over social media. So I told him, your sounds are fire. Like, do you have any synths that you recommend? He told me that he used a Prophet 08 synthesizer, a Moog Subsequent 37, and a few others. The Prophet 08 is actually the predecessor to what you see over here, which is the Prophet Rev2. Randy was also generous enough to share with me his watered down master chain, which is the foundation of my master chain today. I promise I'll make a video about that and I'll share with you what I have, or at least the watered down version. You can download that and use that as your foundation. Once he told me about the different synthesizers he used, I was doing some research, and at the time, the Prophet synthesizer spoke more to me. There are three main models out there in the market. There's the Prophet 6, the Prophet Rev2, and the OB6. The Rev2 attracted my attention for two main reasons. One, as you can see, there are a lot of different knobs over here, which gives you a lot more control over the sound. There are a lot more parameters that you can modulate and get really creative with it. The second reason was the number of voices that you can use on the synthesizer. So it comes in two different flavors, an 8 voice and a 16 voice. That's on top of the fact that you can layer patches. So you can actually create like patch A and patch B, and you can stack them on top of one another and create these ridiculously fat sounds. When I heard that, I was like, no brainer, I gotta get the Rev2. Now trust me, I wouldn't mind having a studio filled with synthesizers, but the reality is I'm not a top charting artist, so I don't have a top charting budget yet. So that was a synth. I also had a Yamaha CP4 stage piano, but the MIDI didn't work, so I sold it off. I'm planning on replacing that old stage piano with a newer model, probably the CP88, for both the sounds but also the feel. It's important for me to have weighted keys which feel and play like a real piano. In general, I like playing the instruments as much as I can in my productions. It gives me a chance to imprint my touch on the music that I make, and it makes a difference. I'm better able to convey emotion, and the imperfections of human playing result in a more organic experience for the people listening to my music. If I would operate entirely in MIDI, the music tends to sound more artificial. Not to say that you can't incorporate randomness and recreate imperfections, but if I know how to play the instruments, I might as well just play them myself. Sometimes I don't play the part perfectly all the way through. So I like having a parallel MIDI clip where I can always go in and fine-tune the MIDI notes and then re-record the output of the instrument. Obviously less relevant for guitars. Speaking of which, I got a bass guitar, electric guitar, and this Cordoba acoustic guitar. After I finished my first EP, I got tired of borrowing my dad's bass guitar. The electric components broke at some point, so I had to take it to a shop to get them fixed. This shop happened to create custom guitars. And the name of this shop is Shabat Guitars. It's run by a guy named Avi. And let me tell you, these guitars feel and sound amazing. I've held a lot of guitars. During that time, I was on the lookout and I was going to guitar centers, Sam Ash, testing and feeling different models, but nothing felt quite like holding a guitar that was made in this guy's shop. I had this gut feeling and immediately I put in an order for an electric guitar and a bass guitar. That was over a year ago and I finally got these just like a few months ago. So I'm excited to finally put these guitars to use and incorporate them into my productions. I also plan on making sampler instruments for Ableton using the sounds of these guitars. Eventually they'll be up on analogtides.com. When they are, I'll let you know. So I've got these 3 guitars and I probably won't be buying any more because using software plugins, I can manipulate them to sound however I want. For me, the most important thing is that the source sound is as high quality as possible, and these 3 check off the boxes. And that notion of quality over quantity leads me to the last thing that I wanted to talk about in this video. So I know earlier I mentioned it would be nice to have a studio filled with gear like Calvin Harris, but truthfully I'd rather have a small collection of gear that I know really well as opposed to a studio filled with stuff that I have a shallow understanding of. My philosophy is limitations breed creativity. This is a universal law. It doesn't exist just in the world of music, it exists in the world of business and engineering. Obviously, if the limitations are too restrictive, that can stifle creativity and that can be demotivating, but having a healthy limitation on the tools that you use to make music can be very beneficial for your creative work. Some of the most exciting music was made by artists earlier in their career, probably because of the limitation of budgets, timeline, a smaller team. They're super honed into their craft and they master the tools that they have at their disposal. So they're an autopilot. All they have to do is just focus on the creative process. As you add more gear and more people to your team and you get distracted by all this other stuff, you get more and more distanced from that creative process. And as a result, your work tends to become more dull. I don't want to generalize, I'm just saying that in most cases, that's what happens. And when you operate with limited gear or limited sounds, limited plugins, that's actually when you define your sound. It's what makes you stand out in a sea of noise. It's what stops a person when they're walking in the mall and they hear your song being played in the background and they're able to recognize that it's your work. I challenge you to look with a critical eye at your setup and maybe embrace these kinds of limitations. And what you'll notice is that's when the magic starts happening.